History is written in the bold strokes of myths, yet the true pulse of the past resides in human complexities. When looking back at the 18th century, the figure that dominates the cultural imagination of Eastern Europe is depicted in permanent gravity, wrapped in an aura of supreme, unyielding power. We see Catherine II, Catherine the Great of Russia, as she appeared in his twilight years, a formidable, sharp-witted autocrat navigating the gilded, labyrinthine corridors of the Winter Palace, isolated in an empire of her own reshaping, her expression frozen in a calculating, deeply commanding gaze. He became the anchor for an era of staggering transformation, guiding Russia through the existential trauma of modernization while expanding its borders to the edges of the Black Sea. Yet, this legendary archetype of the iron-willed, ruthless empress was entirely a creation of her later life, a protective armor forged to shield a soul of intense intellectual passion, volatile emotions, and an unyielding willpower. To view her only through her territorial conquests or her scandalous court gossip is to miss the extraordinary journey of a young German princess who was systematically isolated in an alien land, only to rise up, defy the clinical realities of her age, and reshape the identity of modern Russia. Her life began with the crushing weight of dynastic expectations born of minor European nobility. Born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst on May 2, 1729, in Stettin, she entered a world governed by the strict opportunistic whim of her ambitious family. Orchestrated by her domineering mother and the pressures of continental diplomacy, the princess's youth became a regimented, suffocating ordeal of physical and emotional isolation designed to stamp out any trace of independence or nonconformity. She was forced to adapt to a foreign court, facing a daily schedule filled with strict court dogma and grueling linguistic and religious studies, while being kept entirely ignorant of the practical mechanics of imperial rule. This systematic neglect and emotional starvation in a freezing, alien landscape were intended to break Catherine's fiercely independent spirit, ensuring that when he eventually married into the Romanov dynasty, she would be nothing more than a compliant, predictable instrument of the Russian imperial state. However, the court completely miscalculated the psychological fortitude of the young Grand Duchess. Beneath her quiet, forced compliance lay a fierce hereditary stubbornness and a burning resentment for the drab, volatile reality of the Russian court. Catherine found solace in her secret world of imagination and her intense love for literature, creating an internal kingdom of philosophy and political theory where she possessed the total control denied to him in reality. The true test of her resolve arrived in January 1762, when Empress Elizabeth passed away suddenly, leaving Catherine's erratic husband, Peter III, to inherit a fractured empire. The young, strikingly intelligent Grand Duchess received the news with a mixture of dread and instant determination. His first major acts threatened the stability of the state, forcing Catherine to assert her independence by summoning powerful allies to St. Petersburg, funding a revolutionary network of loyal guards with political capital. However, this desire to realize an enlightened utopia quickly led to the first major crisis of her reign, throwing her government into chaos. In 1762, the geopolitical landscape erupted when she orchestrated a daring coup d'etat to depose her unstable husband. Seeing her empire's vulnerability and her own fragile legitimacy, Catherine reluctantly aligned with the military guards, but the swift, ruthless deposition of Peter III shattered her political illusions. The most devastating blow came when her husband perished under mysterious circumstances, effectively branding her in the eyes of European critics as a dangerous usurper. Surrounded by ministers who urged caution and a traditional nobility that sought to limit her realm, the young sovereign refused to break emotionally. Day after day, she defied her own cautious counselors, choosing to master the ruthless mechanics of power rather than participate in a political theater where she was merely a figurehead. The definitive consolidation of Russian autonomy was sealed in the decades that followed as she orchestrated the modernization of the empire. Stripped of traditional dynastic legitimacy, Catherine redirected her unyielding willpower toward a radical, physical manifestation of her internal world. Guided by her own sharp, centralized aesthetic and intellectual vision, she systematically turned away from old Muscovite isolation and began her drive for total cultural and structural creation. Her most radical undertaking was the acquisition of the vast Hermitage collection and the construction of magnificent palace complexes, a revolutionary step that laid the foundations of Russia's modern cultural mythology, demonstrating a volatile yet deeply progressive approach to preserving her autocratic authority through enlightenment rather than mere force. Amidst these structural upheavals, Catherine lived out a complex, deeply unconventional personal life that brought little peace and constant internal isolation. Having discarded her disastrous marriage, she fiercely protected her independence and her private emotional sanctuary, refusing to ever take a husband who could challenge her absolute power. After years of internal tournament and intense pressure from her court to secure the succession, she abruptly broke off traditional expectations, choosing to keep her private life entirely under her own control. Instead, she lived out her days in a deeply isolated, carefully managed enclave of close friends, powerful favorites, and brilliant statesmen like Potemkin, wrestling with the profound psychological agony of her immense responsibilities and her private desires, which she managed with intense focus and calculated pragmatism. Between 1768 and 1796, Catherine poured astronomical sums and human resources into the parallel expansion of Russian borders and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. This relentless cycle of warfare and reform was managed entirely through her centralized command, yet it rapidly drained the imperial treasury and paralyzed her private cabinet. By systematically balancing her autocratic duties with her intellectual correspondence with figures like Voltaire, she created a vast network of alliances, earning her the permanent historical moniker of the Great, even as her government grew increasingly desperate to halt internal instability. But this artistic and philosophical harmony was shattered in the mid-1770s and 1780s as the brutal realities of her empire became imminent. The social costs of her rapid modernization reached catastrophic levels, culminating in the bloody Pugachev Rebellion, a massive peasant uprising that threatened to dismiss the entire government. Seeing her vulnerability and fearing a societal crisis, Catherine instantly conspired with the nobility to secure her power. Led by her generals, the government engineered a brutal military suppression, utilizing absolute force to crush the rebellion. A turning point that forced Catherine to abandon her dreams of serf emancipation without a single practical modification of the social structure. The ultimate tragedy of this political legacy unfolded rapidly in her final years. The outbreak of the French Revolution arrived to shake the foundations of her authority, placing her empire in a state of ideological siege. Taken by fear of radical Jacobin influence, an increasingly desperate Catherine abandoned her beloved philosophical sanctuary, turning her rule into a rigid, defensive autocracy. Though she did not survive to see the ultimate fate of European monarchies, her frantic private crackdowns on dissent revealed an intuitive, terrifying awareness of the fragile foundations upon which her royal identity rested, refusing to accept the rising tide of democratic revolution that threatened her absolute power. By 1796, the heavy toll of lifelong governance, profound political stress, and rapidly deteriorating health brought the twilight of her era to a definitive close. On the morning of November 17, 1796, the 67-year-old monarch suffered a sudden stroke within the private chambers of the Winter Palace, from which she never returned. Hours later, the Grand Empress passed away under solemn circumstances, leaving her subjects in a state of profound shock. Despite her foreign origins, the common people of Russia had deeply respected her majestic presence. Catherine II was a ruler defined by stark contradictions, intensely progressive in her embrace of the Enlightenment, deeply intellectual, and capable of profound aesthetic insight, yet possessed of a monumental detachment from the suffering of her serfs, a reckless disregard for democratic liberties, and a severe cynicism toward the political systems of her time. She entered a changing traditional world as an outsider who had no blood claim to the throne, and through sheer force of will, left behind a physical and geopolitical legacy of empire and art that saved Russia from cultural isolation, turning her private ambitions into the permanent identity of her homeland. In the end, the cynical, absolute autocrat who ruled from the winter shadows and the passionate, defiant youth who had conquered an empire were one and the same, a sovereign who navigated the treacherous boundaries between personal torment and cultural survival, leaving a permanent mark on the face of Central and Eastern Europe.